A Young Princess, written by Steve A. Hall, narrated by Ella Whitehead. Chapter 1. There was a poor family. There was a poor family who lived in a village, surviving each day on food scraps they salvaged. Those words summarise all too well the everyday life of Martin and Shailene, parents of 2 young sons, Stefan and Lolek. The family was as poor as it could be, but it mattered not, because they were wealthy in love and rich in compassion. They lived in a shabbily built mud-flat home on one of the outlying streets of the village of Norwalk, located in the heart of the land called Astoria. Although he never voiced it, Martin appreciated the fact that he lived on an outlying street rather than closer to the village centre. Sure, Martin had to walk farther on the cold mornings to get to the landowner's estate where he worked, but living here on the outskirts of the village, Martin felt a sense of safety for his family, particularly for his 2 young boys, especially in view of the recent reports of kidnapping that were circulating throughout the land. As he sat next to his beloved wife Shailene on one of the simple benches inside their home this evening, Martin reflected on the whirlwind of the past 2 years. It was about that long ago when their firstborn son, Stefan, came into the world. And now that blonde-haired boy was walking, saying a few words, and even pretending to be a worker like his father. It seemed like Stefan could never get enough of playing with his digging tools, which were a couple of small sticks that Martin had carved to resemble the real thing. Martin was sure his oldest son would grow up and work for one of the local landowners, working long days under the sun cultivating ground, just as Martin did. And then there was Martin's youngest son, Lolek, who turned a year old only a few days ago. Despite Lolek's very young age, Martin thought he could see right into the boy's heart and mind, as he displayed such a playful personality. Lolek seemed to especially gravitate towards music and sounds, because whenever his mother played her wooden flute at night, the boy was mesmerised. As he did regularly on this night, Lolek fell asleep listening to the soft sounds of the flute, and now he was lost in his dreams, resting peacefully in the basket on a table near where Martin and Shailene were sitting. Lolek was sick recently with arrowweed fever, but seemed to be getting better by the day. The older boy turned out to be a light sleeper, so his basket was in the back room of the mud-flat home, where it was quieter. That was important in the early morning, when Martin would get up and leave for work before the crack of dawn, to ensure Stefan did not wake up at the same time. Both boys wore special handmade necklaces, holding pendants cut out of basterwood, which was imported from a distant land. The necklaces were very rare, extraordinary presents from the landowner Martin worked for, one of the few kind things that happened to him over the years. As Martin thought about these things, with Shailene resting her head of long black hair on his right shoulder, he began to drift off to sleep. Suddenly there was a pounding at the front door, and Martin awoke with a start. "Open up in there! Open up in there!" a growling voice shouted from outside their home. Martin glanced from the door back to Shailene. He saw her instinctively leap up, hurrying off into the back room where Stefan was sleeping. The pounding and shouting started once again, but this time there were several voices. Martin looked at the door once again, and he observed what appeared to be the reflected light of torches coming through the bottom crack of the wooden door frame. "This is your last chance. Either open up or suffer the consequences," the voice outside demanded. Martin stood up, and it dawned on him that he didn't have any weapons inside the house with which he could defend himself or his family. Martin was a man of peace, not of fighting. Slowly, fear gripped him by the throat. He was shaking so much he could barely get the words out of his mouth. "What do you want with us? Leave us alone!" At that exact moment, the door came crashing in from the top and slammed onto the mud floor with a thump. 3 large men entered the home, 2 of them with torches, and all 3 of them with swords. The commotion woke up the youngest boy, Lolek, and caused dust and debris to fly into Martin's face as he fell backward onto the ground. With the sound of Lolek's crying coming from behind him, Martin looked up at the 3 men who had come into his house. They were wearing dark clothing, and their faces appeared to be covered with a coating of mud or charcoal. The largest man, who was holding only a torch, moved forward a couple of steps in front of the other 2. He walked with a noticeable limp and was the one who spoke. "You know why we are here. You didn't pay your dues last month to the Order of Rebels. Every citizen in this disputed territory is required to pay 2 silver coins per month to receive our protection. Those who don't pay up suffer the gravest of consequences, as you are about to." "Please, give me a chance to explain," pleaded a clearly frightened and intimidated Martin. "I needed to use the money to buy some medicine, because my youngest boy came down with a serious case of arrowweed fever. If I hadn't bought the medicine, his life could have been in danger, and the illness could have easily spread to his older brother." "We don't want to hear your sob stories," responded the largest intruder. "But I tell you what, since you're so concerned with the health of your 2 sons, we are going to do something nice to help care for them tonight. We are going to take them with us and raise them to be part of our rebel army." The intruder motioned his arm toward the crying child in the basket and ordered, "Soldiers, take this baby into custody and search the house for the other child." Martin was now sitting up on the ground, but found himself paralyzed with fear. Summoning every ounce of strength and willpower, Martin shouted, "Shailene, run for it!" But it was too late. Not too late because the 2 rebel soldiers were about to stop her, but too late because she was already gone. The moment Shailene heard the pounding at the door, her instinct caused her to rush into the back room. She wasted no time taking Stefan out of his woven basket and climbing out the back window into the dirt alleyway behind their home. She paused only long enough to grab a sheepskin blanket to wrap around Stefan later. Running out into the night, she knew there would be no haven. There would be no place she could run to, no place she could hide. Nobody in Norwalk ever dared to venture out into the streets after dark, for the rebels had spread fear throughout the land. Martin finally came out of his temporary paralysis. He almost jumped halfway across the room as he tackled the soldier reaching for Lolek. Martin and the soldier fell hard onto the dirt floor, with Martin landing squarely on top of him. Seeing this, the other soldier diverted from his planned route into the back room. Martin was overmatched entirely as he faced 2 highly trained rebel soldiers. But his plan wasn't to defeat them. He planned to delay them, so Shailene would have more time to get as far away from here as possible. And it worked, as he was able to struggle with them for nearly a minute before being subdued once and for all. "You fools!" shouted the largest rebel, obviously the leader of the group. "The wife and other child are escaping. Quit wasting precious time on this worthless peasant and get after them. Prince Agis will be very upset if we don't return with 2 children tonight. And if he's upset, then I will be upset, and I'll make sure you both understand that very well." Leaving the lead rebel, an injured Martin, and one hysterically crying baby behind, the 2 soldiers hurried into the back room. The dark room was instantly brightened by the torches they carried. The soldier slowed down and moved cautiously toward the open window, exiting it one by one. "Which way do you think she went?" one soldier asked the other once they were both outside. "That way," the other soldier answered as he pointed to something on the ground. It was the blanket Shailene brought with her at the last second. When it dropped to the ground as she started running, she decided she could spare no more time and kept going. The guards withdrew their swords and headed off in the same direction, toward the village cemetery. Shailene continued down the dark alleyway, holding on to Stefan as tightly as she possibly could. She didn't see any candlelights burning in any of the other windows of her neighbours' mud-flat homes. As she was looking desperately into the last window at the end of the alley, she turned her head back in time to see something lunge toward her out of nowhere. Fortunately, it was only a white cat she spooked with her fast-approaching footsteps. At the end of the alleyway, she found herself on the main dirt road leading into town. She had two choices at this point. She could turn south and head further away from the village into a maze of mud-flat homes, or she could turn north and go directly into the village centre, where she could hope to run into the 2 royal guards who were posted in Norwalk. Of course, Norwalk was a sizable village, and who knew where the royal guards would be at this time, or even if they were awake and fulfilling their duties. With sweat now dropping from her face despite the cold temperature, Shailene made her decision. She went with the unthinkable, which was choice number 3. Directly in front of her was a small hillside that led up to the village cemetery, which was surrounded by oak trees, but without any fences. Surely somewhere in the large cemetery filled with tombstones, memory gardens, and plants, she would be able to find a place where she could hide from the rebels, should any of them decide to come after her. Besides, this was a bold move on her part. If anything, the rebels would expect her to turn north, heading back into town, hoping to find help. The crescent moon above provided enough light for her to make her way up the hillside into the midst of the cemetery. Meanwhile, Stefan had literally been shaken awake with all the running, but he stayed quiet as a tomb. About 2 minutes later, the soldiers emerged from the dark alleyway at the same junction, and like Shailene, they paused to debate their next course of action. "We'd better get this right. You heard what the boss said back there," one soldier muttered to the other. The other soldier, who was named Owen, responded with logical thinking. He said, "Look, Trent, there is nothing to discuss. She is going to try to head toward the village centre to look for the royal guards. Our surveillance puts them near the King's Fountain usually at this time of night, but I highly doubt the peasant's wife knows that. It will literally take her hours to find them, and by then, we will have taken her and the other child into custody. Let's get a move on it." With that, they turned north toward the village centre, unaware that they were being watched by a middle-aged peasant woman who was holding her 2-year-old son at the top of a hill behind an oak tree, no more than 100 yards away from them. As she watched them head away from her around a bend, Shailene finally breathed a sigh of relief. "That was close," she whispered to her oldest son. He looked back at her and smiled, not understanding what she was saying, but evidently aware that some danger had now passed. He was still looking her in the eyes when she continued talking. "You must be so cold, my dear boy. I'm sorry for dropping your blanket back there, but Mummy needs to make sure you are safe first, and then I can take you back home to get another one, okay? Now, let's go see if we can find a warm hiding place where we can stay tonight." By her estimates, Shailene knew there were still about 5 hours until the first visible light would appear on the horizon. She planned to search through the overgrown smaller trees and dense shrubs that grew in the memory gardens of the cemetery until she found a perfect place for them to hide until daybreak. As she passed by the tombstones, Shailene inadvertently zigzagged through them, taking a familiar route. It was only a few months ago that she had been here in this exact cemetery burying her parents. They had lived a happy, fulfilling life in Norwalk, despite being poor peasants until the day of their death. They taught Shailene from an early age that happiness comes from appreciating what you have, not longing for what you do not have. As she passed their grave markers, Shailene thought about the lesson and realised it was something that could help her survive this night. She had already likely lost Lolek, and possibly even her husband Martin, to the rebels. But no matter what, she could still save Stefan. She needed to stay alive and keep him safe, so she could raise him to have a good life. As she approached the edge of the grassy area in the cemetery, she heard the faint sound of thunder rumbling in the distance. It caused her to hurry a little bit quicker as she turned to the north, taking a dirt path into the Memory Gardens. Meanwhile, the two soldiers jogged nearly half a mile toward the central part of the village. The dirt road they were on began to break away from the hillside it was following abruptly. Additionally, a river flowed in from the west, turned north, and flowed parallel to the main road into the village centre. Noticing this, the rebel soldier Owen said, "Hold on a minute, I have an idea." "All right," the rebel Trent responded. "What is it?" Owen quickly explained. "Think about it for a minute. We've been pushing hard for nearly 5 minutes, and the woman and child are nowhere to be seen. We're about to lose our only advantage because the road is turning away from this hill. Our best bet is to go to the top of the hill where we can get a clear view of the village. There's nobody else out in the village at this time, so we will be able to clearly see if there's any movement on any of the roads. I say, once we are up there, we will spot her in a matter of seconds, not minutes." "All right, but if you're wrong, you're taking the fall for this one," Trent barked back. The two rebel soldiers threw their torches into the river as they turned off the road and began climbing up through the grassy brush. The iron-handled torches slowly sank to the bottom after hissing upon contact with the water, releasing a small cloud of steam. Though they didn't realise it, the two rebel soldiers were now climbing up the same hillside Shailene had gone up, although they were further down from her. Back at Martin's mudflat home, quiet prevailed for the time being, but it was only because the largest rebel, the one leading the small group that had broken into Martin's home, knocked Martin unconscious when he would not stop yelling for help. The largest rebel's name was Robbins, and he was really focused on fulfilling his mission. When Martin and his family did not pay the 2 silver coins required of all peasants in the area, they were targeted by Prince Agus, the leader of all rebels, to lose their children. Robbins didn't feel bad about kidnapping, because he himself helped raise some of those who were taken. Prince Agus had instituted this new campaign with a twofold purpose. First, to strike fear into the hearts of families throughout Astoria, making them think the royal guards couldn't protect anybody from the rebels. And second, to provide the next generation of rebels, ones who would be ready to take up the cause and fight in 10 to 15 years, depending on their age. Robbins thought of it as a foolproof plan, one showing the brilliant mind of Prince Agus. "That's why I signed up for this cause," he thought, "because Prince Agus will someday restore this land to its former glory." Robbins even considered the possibility that if he completed this mission successfully and brought back both boys, he could be promoted and become one of the few people who had actually seen the face of Prince Agus. The thought of that compelled him to work a little faster as he tied Martin's hands behind his back with some strong rope. In the memory gardens of the cemetery, Shailene found what appeared to be the perfect hiding spot amid some thick, overgrown brush and small trees. The only thing that made hiding inside it difficult was the drizzle, which started to fall only a few minutes ago. The clouds continued to cover up more of the sky by the minute, and the sound of thunder grew even closer. If the rain worsened significantly, Shailene would have to move, or she would risk getting drenched and potentially falling ill along with Stefan. That was the last thing she wanted for Stefan after the harrowing experience she went through recently with Lolek's sickness. Lolek somehow contracted arrowwood fever, which proved to be one of the deadliest illnesses in the region over the past decade. It seemed that mostly children under 5 years of age were susceptible to catching it, particularly among the peasants. Shailene knew of 3 children in Norwalk besides Lolek who had contracted the fever over the past few years. One of those children, a 4-year-old girl, tragically died because of it. The girl's family was unable to come up with the necessary money to purchase the medicine needed to cure her. Eventually, they appealed to both the village statesman and the royal family for help. One of the local landowners finally donated the funds, but by then, it was too late. The girl was too far gone and could not recover. Being at the cemetery reminded Shailene of that whole situation, knowing the girl's grave marker was somewhere amid the rows and rows of tombstones. Shailene and Martin were determined not to let their own sons suffer the same fate. Thus, they took the risk of using the 2 silver coins, which were intended for the rebels, to buy medicine for Lolek. Shailene and Martin were hoping the rebels would either not have noticed the missing funds, which were supposed to be left in a sack tacked onto the front door on the 1st of every month, or they would have been understanding when they learned the reasons for not being paid. After all, the tax the rebels demanded of the people was unlawful. The royal family had assigned 2 royal guards to the village in the hope of clamping down on illegal activities there. However, the results seemed to be just a token gesture, as nothing much changed. Abruptly, Shailene's thought pattern was shattered as a lightning bolt struck the ground about 50 feet from the place where she and the toddler were hiding. It was followed instantaneously with a large boom of thunder and shrieking cries of fear from Stefan. The 2 rebel soldiers had been standing on the top of the ridge for a few minutes now, muttering complaints about the weather and surveying the town below for any signs of life.
"Well, you've done it now," Trent started to say. "Robbins is going to put us both in stocks for a week after the—"
The soldiers' words were cut off by a flash of lightning which lit up the whole sky. Both soldiers turned to see the last remnants of the lightning strike behind them. It was followed by thunder and something else, almost like a shriek or a scream.
"Did you hear that?" the rebel soldier Trent asked. "What was that?" "That, my friend, is our second chance," responded Owen.
Both took off running slightly downhill in the direction of the lightning bolt and Shailene's hiding spot. Shailene tried to calm the child down quickly, but a few of his screams carried on past the end of the thunder. The rain was getting steadier now, and Shailene was really worried about being caught. If the rebels were down on the road below the cemetery, she knew it was likely they had heard Stefan's screams. Or worse yet, if they were searching specific parts of the cemetery, they would be able to narrow down the search area and find her quickly now. Sound carried well at night, particularly in a village where nobody goes out after dark. She debated the decision briefly, but decided to stay put for a bit longer. She couldn't risk going back down to the main road, and she couldn't risk leaving her hiding place to try to find a new one yet. The only other thing she could do was exit the cemetery on the other side, opposite the direction she first came in. She knew the hill crested after a short distance and then descended back toward a river, which followed the hillside for a while before making an abrupt turn into town. Through the sound of the rain, Shailene thought she heard voices and footsteps, not close by, but at some distance away. She shifted her weight onto her knees and tried to peer through the dense brush in which she was hiding. As she was trying to look, she didn't realize that more rain was getting on Stefan. He made a few sounds as if he was about to cry. Hearing this, Shailene quickly pulled back to the relative shelter of the thick brush and sat back down to try to soothe Stefan. She knew that one scream or burst of crying from Stefan would mean they would be caught, and she would lose Stefan, possibly forever. She refocused all her energy on consoling him and ensuring he remained calm. Meanwhile, the rebels' voices and footsteps grew closer. Shailene could now make out a few words they said. "They must be in here somewhere. Let's turn this whole place upside down if we have to," the rebel soldier Owen said. "I don't care if we have to wake up the dead to find them. We'll do it," Trent added. Soon, their footsteps began to come very close. They sounded like they were about 20 feet away, 10 feet, and then 5 feet. Shailene was terrified for a moment, but relieved when they kept walking right past her hiding place. She could now see them through the brush. There were 2 of them. One of them was holding a sword, and the other had a sword in a scabbard attached to his belt. They had walked down the pathway coming from the other end of the Memory Gardens. Shailene realised that they must have come in from the northern part of the cemetery grounds, which was an odd place to enter. No doubt they were searching another location when Stefan's scream attracted their attention. As they were walking away, the soldier on the left turned back and seemed to look directly at Shailene's hiding place. It almost felt like he was gazing into her eyes with his eerily dark face, which was covered in mud to conceal his identity. Shailene froze, wondering if she was spotted. A moment later, the soldier turned his face back around and kept walking toward the grave sites, tombstones, and memorial plaques of varying shapes and sizes. The soldiers stopped about a minute later and conversed with each other for a brief period. Then one of them called out with a loud voice,
"Peasant woman, we know you are hiding somewhere in here. We're going to give you one chance. Come out now and turn yourself in, and we will spare your life. We will even allow you and your husband to keep your pitiful home."
After there was no response to the offer, one soldier screamed out with rage and kicked over a tombstone standing next to him. Both soldiers started aggressively searching around the larger grave markers, memorial plaques, and statues. When Shailene was sure they were as far away from her as they were possibly going to get in their search, before turning back to come closer, she bolted. Holding Stefan firmly with both hands, she crawled out of her hiding place and began running in the opposite direction from the rebels. If she could make it over the small crest of the hill, she would be out of sight and headed down toward the river. But it wasn't to be. Shailene slipped in the mud and landed on her back, with Stefan still in her arms. As she was getting back up, one of the rebel soldiers spotted her, and both immediately went into pursuit. They were quite far away, but would be able to make up the time in a matter of minutes. Shailene dared a glance back and saw she had been spotted, as she went over the crest and started running downhill as fast as she deemed safe. She hardly even noticed the pouring rain at this point, focused instead on the swiftly moving river a short distance away. When she came to the bottom of the hill, she started pushing her way through some thick reeds that separated the hill from the riverbank. She needed a plan, and needed it fast. There was no time to think, though, because she looked back and discovered the two soldiers were coming over the crest of the hill behind her. A few more steps, and Shailene emerged out of the elbow-high reeds onto the bank of the river. Just to her right, buried slightly in the mud, Shailene noticed part of a fallen tree trunk that extended out into the river. It was approximately 8 feet long, with half of it submerged in the water. With Stefan in her left hand, she used her right to try to free the tree trunk from the mud. It was no use. She didn't have the strength to do it. Shailene glanced back and saw the soldiers already halfway down the hill. Taking a few steps back, she gently set Stefan down on the bank. All the while, he was watching her with fascination. In fact, he had rarely seen what the world outside looked like at night, so every move and sound was like something new to him. With both hands, Shailene pulled as hard as she could on the tree trunk. Finally, it budged. Mud and sand fell off the end she pulled up, and quickly the current of the river tried to pull the makeshift floating device away from Shailene. She didn't have the strength to fight the current, so she briefly let go to pick Stefan back up. Returning with him held firmly at her side, she plopped into the icy water and wrapped her free arm around the floating log. She didn't need to do anything to get the log moving, as the current took care of that problem. Quickly, they were picking up speed as the river flowed down toward the village centre. The two soldiers emerged at the riverbank and could hardly believe their eyes. There was the peasant woman and her son, holding on for dear life to a log, being taken down the river by the current.
"Don't even think about jumping in after her," Owen said firmly. "It's much too dangerous, and we'd have to ditch our swords here. Let's follow her along the riverbank from a distance, and when she tries to get out of the river, we will make her move. Maybe the rain will let up a little by then."
The rebel soldier Trent agreed, so they followed close behind. They maintained a jogging pace to keep up with the rapid-moving current. From Shailene's vantage point, she couldn't see a thing. She was clinging for dear life to the log as she floated down the river. It was remarkable she could do this, but she didn't know how much longer she would be able to hang on. Her lower body was going numb from the cold water. She didn't know what hazards might lie beneath it, and the pouring rain was limiting visibility to just a few feet as it splashed off the water all around her continuously. Still, Shailene held onto Stefan and held onto the log, realising what was at stake. As the river rounded a bend and straightened out, Shailene thought she knew where she was. If she were right, she would travel through one more series of intense rapids before the river would level out and calm down as it made its way into the village centre. Once there, she could stay in the river and hide under one of the many wooden bridges that crossed from one side of Norwalk to the other, or she could get out and try to find a new hiding place until the morning. Shailene hadn't decided by the time she entered the final set of rapids, white water churning all around her. Stefan traded off between crying and spitting out water at this point, but his mother could do little to help him as they both made their way through the rapids. Remarkably, they didn't hit any rocks or get pulled under at any point, clearing the rapids intact. As the water became gentler and the ride more peaceful, Stefan calmed down. Shailene tried to guide the log she was holding in the direction of the right side of the riverbank. They were now in the village centre, passing under the first of many bridges. Shailene managed to pull the log over to the side a few minutes later. Once she could touch the ground, she began wading out of the river. She looked down at Stefan. He was shivering intensely and not saying a word, seemingly traumatised by the whole experience. Soon, she emerged from the water onto a bank of wet sand. She was exhausted, but needed to keep moving. Still carrying Stefan, she started walking up a small dune with her damp and worn-out sandals. She figured that she would come out onto the main road half a block away from the exact centre of town. At the top of the bank, she was astonished to find the 2 rebel soldiers waiting for her. They startled her so much she almost dropped Stefan. But she didn't, and she did the only thing left in her power that she could do. She screamed at the top of her lungs. "Help me, someone! Help me, please!" she cried out. One soldier quickly moved to quiet her down by putting a gag through her mouth. The other soldier took Stefan away and watched as Shailene was tied up. A few minutes earlier, the 2 royal guards assigned to their post in Norwalk were sitting near the King's Fountain, talking about old times. They had been in the village for several months as part of a 6-month assignment. Their purpose in being here, as clearly explained to them by the Chief Royal Knight, was to watch over the wealthy landowners of the town. They were to ensure that the wealthy were not bothered in any way by the rebels or other criminals. At the same time, they were to safeguard and protect the royal family's property in Norwalk, places such as the spectacularly designed King's Fountain. Their conversation on this uneventful night drifted to 2 women they met on their previous assignment. "I think I've fallen in love," one royal guard said to the other. "This could be it for me." The other royal guard laughed heartily and replied, "I hope so, Matthew. I expect to be the best man at your wedding, as you will be at mine." He rubbed his ample belly and thoughtfully added, "And there better be some good food there as well." Their conversation ended abruptly as a woman's scream pierced the night. The scream was close, perhaps coming from just around the corner, out on the river road. The 2 royal guards drew their swords and ran as fast as they could toward the woman's voice, which could no longer be heard. When they rounded the bend, they saw the rebel soldiers. One was holding a child, and the other was leaning down, tying knots around the woman's arms, which were being placed behind her. Without saying a word to each other, they knew what needed to be done. The rebels had to be stopped and taken into custody. Though they were caught by surprise, the rebel soldiers had time to stop what they were doing and prepare for battle. The soldier holding Stefan dropped him to the ground and took out his sword, and the soldier tying up Shailene dropped the ropes he was holding, doing the same. As they moved away from Shailene, she loosened her ropes and picked up Stefan to hold him. She watched as the rebel soldiers engaged in a full-on sword fight with the 2 royal guards. There was a sound of metal clashing against metal. Matthew, the smaller of the 2 royal guards, moved slowly to one side as he was exchanging sword blows with his opponent. He was trying to separate the 2 groups that were fighting, to ensure nothing unexpected happened that he was unprepared for. The other royal guard,
who was stocky in build and named Reginald, saw what Matthew was trying to do, so he moved in the other direction. With space to fight, Matthew let his sword ability do the talking. Although he was a bit rusty, not having been in a real battle since his last assignment, Matthew quickly overpowered his rebel opponent, knocking his sword out of his hands and to the ground. The rebel pleaded for mercy as he dropped to his knees. Matthew went over and picked up the rebel's sword and looked at what was going on in the other battle. His fellow guardsmen could not move as quickly and screamed out in pain as the rebel's sword managed to clip his upper leg. The royal guard was still holding his own, but it was all in defence. With every swing of the rebel's sword, the guard was being pushed backwards. Matthew arrived there just in time, holding his sword to the back of the rebel. "Stop now if you value your life," Matthew told him. Stunned by this development, the rebel halted what he was doing and dropped his sword to the ground. The stocky royal guard, now bleeding from his leg, came over and shoved his rebel opponent to the ground. "By order of the royal family of the peaceful land of Astoria, you are both being taken into custody to await trials for your crimes," Matthew told them both. Robbins, the rebel head of this mission, was growing more agitated back at Martin's home. He couldn't figure out what could be taking the two soldiers so long. After all, the peasant woman could only have had a few minutes lead time on them, and she was carrying a child with her. Something must have happened. With Martin still unconscious, Robbins decided to cut his losses and head back to the rebel camp, which was many hours away by horseback. Robbins couldn't afford to come back with nothing to show for himself. Even worse, Robbins couldn't allow himself to be taken into custody, which would land him in a prison cell for the rest of his days. So he picked up Lolek, who was now fast asleep, and went back out of the open entrance, where the front door used to be located. 3 horses were tied up to a post outside. Robbins untied his horse, climbed up on it while he was holding Lolek, and rode out of the town into the woods. When the royal guards arrived at the home on horseback a little while later, Robbins was gone. Helping Shailene and Stefan down from his horse, Reginald asked them to wait outside while the place was checked out. A few moments later, he appeared back at the open front entrance and told them they could come in. Inside, Martin was slowly waking up as Matthew untied his hands. And so Martin, Shailene, and Stefan were safe, but they would never again be the same. Not without Lolek. They would spend the next decade wondering and worrying about his fate.